I should say to you, I certainly didn't rule it out. I always thought this referendum was pretty close to a 50-50 shot, certainly during the course of the last 2 weeks, when it's pretty clear that the Leave side were making progress. So did I necessarily expect Leave to win? Certainly not. Was I sure that they were going to lose? Equally, certainly not. So I certainly was not entirely surprised at the outcome.
That being said, is it a done deal? It might sound as a bit of a silly question, but we did speak to one guest who said that perhaps British Parliament could end up not going through with the process. Do you see that as all being a possibility?
I don't see that as being a possibility, because the truth is that anybody who tried to do that, I think, would meet retribution at a subsequent general election. What, of course, there is still quite potential room for manoeuvre for is what exactly the relationship between a UK that is formally outside the European Union and the rest of the European Union should be. I mean, whether or not, for example, the United Kingdom would have a free trade agreement, whether or not as a result it would have still to accept some of the freedom of movement provisions, and whether also as a result it might still be paying into the EU budget. Those are clearly some of the things that will now be the subject of the renegotiations of Britain's relationship with the EU in the next 2 years, the outcome of which certainly is cannot necessarily be forecast at this stage.
What about the relationship between different regions within the UK? Uncertainty running high concerning Scotland, of course, which entirely voted to stay in the Union, as well as Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland saying that perhaps a vote is necessary on whether Northern Ireland should leave. Is this the beginning of the breakup of the UK?
Well, it's certainly true that this outcome does put the constitutional status of Scotland in particular, and also Northern Ireland to some degree, back on the table. So far as Scotland is concerned, however, I think one needs to realise there are 3 hurdles that Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, would have to be able to cross before we got to a second independence referendum. The first is, will public opinion in Scotland shift sufficiently that the SNP look as though they would actually win the referendum? The second is, can they get the legislative authority to hold the referendum, given that the authority under which the September 2014 referendum was held came from the House of Commons and was a temporary grant of authority? But thirdly, and perhaps crucially, what would be the attitude of the European Union if Nicola Sturgeon does ring up Donald Tusk and say, look, if we do become independent, are we in or are we out? Because there's no point in Scotland voting for independence if it's going to be outside the European Union in any case. And that's going to present potentially the European Union with perhaps an even tougher choice than what terms and conditions it tries to extract from the UK as the rest of the UK tries to leave the Union.
When it comes to the divisions that have now been exposed on both geographical and generational levels there in the United Kingdom, are you concerned that perhaps they are too wide and deep to mend, or in time, as soon as perhaps the dust settles, and as you say, perhaps in years, because it could take that long to negotiate an actual so-called divorce, do you think things can settle down?
Well, I think there is no doubt that the reason at the end of the day why age and education are the 2 big divides that are exposed by this referendum were essentially a division between social liberals, people who are quite comfortable with immigration and globalization, and social conservatives for whom the opposite is true. The reason why that's exposed is, frankly, because of the relatively high levels of immigration that the United Kingdom has experienced in the last 15 years, not least ironically because it was one of very few European Union countries to give the original entrants from Eastern and Central Europe the automatic freedom of right when they first joined in 2004. We are perhaps where we are, ironically, because the UK unusually was relatively Europhile at that particular time. And I think, in truth, until the issue of immigration comes down, that divide between social conservatives and social liberals, and therefore between young people and older people, is going to be very difficult to heal.
But will we see it become more divisive in the coming days and time ahead?
Well, I think it's going to be pretty difficult for it to be more divisive than it is now. I mean, one consequence of the fact that we are talking about young people and graduates who are in favour of Remain, and folk at the opposite end of the spectrum who are in favour of leaving, is that in effect much of the British establishment, including the majority of MPs in the Parliament, have just lost a major vote. They've just been told that the ordinary public out there don't believe them. They don't believe what the bankers were telling them. They don't believe what the politicians were telling them. And they don't even say what other experts were telling them. That is an indication of the extent to which there is distrust and discontent amongst ordinary voters about some of the social and economic changes that have been going on the last 10 or 15 years. And unless those are addressed, again, it's going to be difficult to heal. I think above all, perhaps the message is that the tiger of globalization is going to have to be tamed rather more than it has been in the recent past if British and indeed West European publics are going to be taken along with that process.